You'll notice he no longer suffers delusions of humanity.
Affirmative.
Welcome back, Tribe. We're about to finally wrap this book up with part 4. We're going to cover chapter 7 in the appendix. And I also have a couple of surprises that I'm going to have put in at the end. So we're not going to waste time. We're going to get right to it. You already know how we're going to do. I ain't going to talk too much, so let's go. Chapter 7, A Fight for the Presidency. Immediately after the death of Madame Blavatsky, a most instructive fight took place for the presidency. Mr. W.Q. Judge, the vice president who controlled the American branch of the society, cabled, "Do nothing till I come." With all speed, he came to London and took possession of Madame Blavatsky's room and keys. From her desk, he secured the Chinese paper, envelopes, colored pencils, and seal with which Madame fabricated the Mahatma letters, and at once made use of them. Mr. Judge proposed to Mrs. Besant that the presidency should be divided between himself and her. Poor old Colonel Olcott, the nominal president, whom Madame Blavatsky had ruined, was to be kicked out altogether. He was considered too old to be of any service to the society, and he was at times too candid in his statements. It was proposed to consult the Mahatma Morya. Accordingly, a letter was written to him and put in the usual cabinet from which letters disappeared by psychic means. This letter did not disappear, and so, after it had remained there some hours, Mr. Judge suggested that it should be opened, as frequently Mahatmas precipitated their replies inside the letter. Accordingly, the letter was opened, and to Mrs. Besant's utter astonishment, there was the word "yes" written upon the letter in red pencil in Morya's handwriting. A meeting of the council was called to consider the matter. Mrs. Besant presided, and when arranging her papers, found amongst them a slip of Mahatma paper with the words written upon it in red pencil. "Judge's plan is right." This also was in the unmistakable handwriting of Morya and bore his seal, one of the very peculiar design, with a monogram M upon it, standing for Morya. Letters were also found by Mrs. Besant in various places, just as they had been found in Madame Blavatsky's time. Mrs. Besant was in ecstasy. Here was abundant proof of the existence of the Mahatmas, the first she had ever had. A meeting was held at the Hall of Science on August 30th after Madame's death, at which Mrs. Besant made the following historic speech, which created the greatest excitement. "You have known me in this hall for 16.5 years. You have never known me tell a lie. No, never," and loud cheers. "I tell you that since Madame Blavatsky left, I have had letters in the same handwriting as the letters which she received. Unless you think that dead persons can write, surely that is a remarkable fact. You are surprised. I do not ask you to believe me, but I tell you it is so. All the evidence I had of the existence of Madame Blavatsky's teachers of the so-called abnormal powers came through her. It is not so now, unless even sense can at the same time deceive me, unless a person can at the same time be sane and insane. I have exactly the same certainty for the truth of the statements I have made as I know that you are here. I refuse to be false to the knowledge of my intellect and the perceptions of my reasoning faculties." Mahatma letters were forwarded to Colonel Olcott, who was in India, but the colonel was not to be had. He knew all about Mahatma letters and Chinese paper, and as for the seal, why, he himself had it cut in Punjab and had given it to Madame Blavatsky as a playful present, he said. Mrs. Besant had a most convenient vision. Mahatma Morya, she said, appeared to her and informed her that he did not write the messages. They were written by Mr. Judge. This statement was supported by the fact that Mr. Judge could get possession of the paper and seal. They had been in Madame's desk, and Mr. Judge had the key. It was decided to probe the matter to the bottom. A judicial committee was summoned to try Mr. Judge. Mrs. Besant, dressed as a Mahatma, presided. A question of jurisdiction was raised by Mr. Judge, and his plea was sustained by the council of the society. His plea was that, even if guilty of misuse of the Mahatma's names and handwriting, he was not amenable to inquiry by the judicial committee, as the offense would have been committed by him as a private member and not in his official capacity. The council also passed a resolution to the effect that a statement as to the truth or otherwise of at least one of the charges as formulated against Mr. Judge would involve a declaration on their part as to the existence or non-existence of the Mahatmas, and that would be a violation of the spirit of neutrality and of the unsectarian nature and constitution of the society. The Judicial Council, however, discussed all these points and considered the whole matter most seriously. Mrs. Besant then, as Mahatma President, delivered judgment in the following words: "I regard Mr. Judge as an occultist, possessed of considerable knowledge and animated by a deep and unswerving devotion to the Theosophical Society. I believe that he has often received direct messages from the masters and from their chelas, guiding and helping him in his work. I believe that he has sometimes received messages for other people in one or other of the ways that I will mention in a moment, but not by direct writing by the master nor by his direct precipitation, and that Mr. Judge has then believed himself to be justified in writing down in the script adopted by HPB Madame Blavatsky for communications from the master the message psychically received, and in giving it to the person for whom it was intended, leaving that person to wrongly assume that it was a direct precipitation or writing by the master himself, that is, that it was done through Mr. Judge but done by the master. Now personally, I hold that this method is illegitimate and that no one should simulate a recognized writing which is regarded as authoritative when it is authentic. And by authentic, I mean directly written or precipitated by the master himself. If a message is consciously written, it should be so stated. If automatically written, it should be so stated. At least so it seems to me. It is important that the very small part generally played by the masters in these phenomena should be understood, so that people may not receive messages as authoritative merely on the ground of their being in particular script. Except in the very rarest instances, the masters do not personally write letters or directly precipitate communications. Messages may be sent by them to those whom they can communicate, by external voice or astrovision or psychic word or mental impression, or in other ways. If a person gets a message which he believes to be from the master for the communication to anyone else, he is bound in honor not to add to that message any extraneous circumstances which will add weight to it in the recipient's eyes. I believe that Mr. Judge wrote with his own hand, consciously or automatically, I do not know, in the master script adopted as that of the master, messages which he received from the master or from the chelas, and I know that, in my own case, I believe that the messages he gave me in the well-known script were messages directly precipitated or directly written by the master. When I publicly said that I had received after H.P. Blavatsky's death letters in the writing H.P. Blavatsky had been accused of forging, I referred to letters given to me by Mr. Judge, and as they were in the well-known script, I never dreamt of challenging their source. I know now that they were not written or precipitated by the master and that they were done by Mr. Judge, but I also believe the gist of these messages was psychically received, and that Mr. Judge's error lay in giving them to me in a script written by himself and not saying that he had done so. I feel bound to refer to these letters thus explicitly, because having been myself mistaken, I in turn misled the public. It must be admitted that as a judicial ruling, this one takes the cake. Portia must take a back seat. Mrs. Besant, however, must be credited with having executed one of the most clever strategical moves ever devised. Whether this display of stratagem will add to her reputation, I will leave that to the reader to decide. This ruling quite satisfied all the members of the committee who, like Mrs. Besant, were anxious that the society should not be broken up and their occupation taken away, but one or two honest men left the society in disgust. And but for them, we should probably have heard nothing of the disgraceful affair. They exposed the whole business in the Westminster Gazette, from which paper I have taken much of the above report. Mr. Judge was most indignant at Mrs. Besant's ruling, and in his capacity as senior vice president of the society issued the following manifesto. I declare Mrs. Besant's headship at an end. Mr. Judge gave 3 reasons for this declaration. Number 1, Mrs. Besant has practiced witchcraft and tried her weird spells. her psychic experiments on Mr. Judge and others. Number 2. Mrs. Besant has pronounced one of the letters of the Mahatma, which was precipitated in an orthodox manner and passed on to Mr. Sennett, a fraud by HPB herself, made up entirely and not from the master. If that letter be a fraud, then all the rest sent through our old teacher are the same. Number 3. Mrs. Besant, in league with the Hindu named Chakravarti and others, has quite flooded the society with documents from phantasmal Mahatmas and black magicians. They had all sorts of letters sent to me from India with pretended messages from the master. The plot exists among the black magicians who ever war against the white. Mr. Judge threatened to establish a new society in opposition to Mrs. Besant under the auspices of American Mahatmas, but all his threats and cursings produced no more effect than those of the cardinal in the jackdaw of Reims. No one was a penny the worse. To avoid further exposure, the quarrel was hushed up. The magic of Mrs. Besant's tongue and the fluent pens of Mr. Sennett, Mr. Leadbeater, and others financially interested kept the Theosophical Society alive. The exposure of this disreputable affair was not as effective as it ought to have been, inasmuch as it appeared in a series of articles which did not reach some sections of society. As a complete, concise, and all cheap report in pamphlet form would have done, and which I intend this pamphlet shall do. Mrs. Besant's chief scheme is to reconcile Christianity with her Theosophy. She asserts that Christ was a Mahatma, and like Satan, she quotes scripture to support her argument. To connect the atheism of Buddhism to the sublime doctrine of Christianity would be a miracle far beyond her power, and the power of all the Mahatmas she can invent. I've been able to do little more than touch the fringe of the history and impostures of Madame Blavatsky within the limit of the pamphlet. An exhaustive account would fill a large volume. To those who desire to look further into the subject, I advise an impartial perusal of the investigations of Dr. Hodgson, published by the Society of Psychical Research. Also, Mr. Arthur Lilly's work, Madame Blavatsky and Her Theosophy, published by Swan, Sonneshin and Co. Mr. Lilly, as a student of Eastern literature, has attacked Madame Blavatsky for her plagiarisms laboriously and has given extracts side by side with the book she copied. Mr. Lilly has also proved that the Mahatma letters were written by Madame Blavatsky, for he has pointed out certain peculiarities of her composition and spelling in them. In writing this pamphlet, I have found Mr. Lilly's work of great service as a book of reference for dates and extracts from publications, saving much time and trouble in referring to original documents. At present, the general public look upon the Theosophical Society as a small community of cranks beneath notice. I trust, however, this small brochure will show the insidious nature of the doctrine and the necessity of checking its spread. Should I succeed in doing this, and in creating a desire for further exposures, I will issue a large edition of this pamphlet, in which I will explain how all the flapdoodle miracles recorded by Mr. Sennett and others could have been accomplished by a tyro in conjuring. I expect much abuse from theosophists for attacking a dead woman, but when the misdeeds of the dead are injuring the living, those misdeeds should be attacked with every possible weapon. Apart from this fact, Madame Blavatsky has a rare champion in Mrs. Besant, who can defend her far better than she could defend herself in life. Doubtless, Mrs. Besant will defend her in the usual way, by fine phrases and verbosity upon the platform. But will she attempt to disprove the charges I have brought? If so, I am prepared to cross swords with her. The most extraordinary thing about the Theosophical Society is that, in the face of all these exposures, it has flourished. Mrs. Besant attributes this to the psychic influence and inspiration of the Mahatmas, and gives it as an absolute proof of their existence. Mrs. Besant herself is the only Mahatma connected with the society, and from her tongue all the influence and inspiration proceed. My copybooks taught me that the pen is mightier than the sword, but to this truism should be added, but the tongue is mightier than the pen. See what it has done for some of our cabinet ministers? For brevity's sake, I have not given chapter and verse for all quotations, but I will supply them if necessary. So as you can see, the society is based on fraud, because they even partake in the undercutting and backbiting of each other. People have an obsession with power. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really get it. I don't understand what's so alluring about power. And now I'm not just saying that and trying to be holier than thou. Power is too much work. I don't got time to be out here trying to rule over people and get control of people. Because you see, the judge went and stole all of Blavatsky's items and continued writing letters. Now it's up in the air if Besant really believed that the letters were real or not. In our earlier readings, when she first joined the society, she threw Blavatsky's writings up against the wall and called it a fraud herself. So that leads me to believe she's a straight up hand puppet. Who's pulling her strings? We'll find that out one day. But then she turns around and uses the deception of Mr. Judge to propel the society forward and breathe new life into it. It's a cold world on the dark side. And then, to cap it all off, she tried to run game on one of the founding members of the society, or founding members of the society. Olcott knew the game up front. Earlier in the readings, once again, he said he knew Blavatsky was lying, but he played along. As a thrall, or of his own free will. We might not know yet, but I know there's some books out there on Olcott, and I'm going to get my hands on them, and then we're going to go over them. So we've come to the end of the book, but we're going to go ahead and read the appendix as well. So we're going to go ahead and get to that. Appendix, a few words to the man in the street. What is Theosophy? What is the aim of it? What are Mahatmas, anyway? These are the questions frequently asked by the man in the street. I will endeavor to answer them to the best of my knowledge, but I have not been able to devote many months of my busy life to study of this cult. Mrs. Besant says, there is nothing more difficult than the understanding of Theosophy. To that I quite agree, if it has to be understood by her lectures and by the literature of the society. I have found that the method of trying to understand Theosophy not only difficult, but costly. I have attended a number of Mrs. Besant's lectures, and I have waded through a pile of expensive literature, verbose and dreary, in the extreme, some of it in subtle language far more difficult to understand than Browning's poetry. Up to the present, all I have been able to learn might have been expressed in a few straightforward paragraphs. It appears that the great aim of the Theosophist should be to become a Mahatma, but that is a troublesome business and it occupies a long time. Before a step can be taken towards this goal, we are told that we must abstain from flesh, marriage, and all worldly pleasures and lead a perfectly pure existence. No one can take exception to the ethics of such a life, if he can to the means of following it. To find a Theosophist following it is as rare as finding the teratological phenomena of a two-headed infant, to use Madame Blavatsky's phraseology. But there are other considerations. We are told that at the death of one who has led such a life, his ego divides into two parts, a good part and a bad part. The bad part becomes a mischievous spook, semi-fiends, Mr. Sinet calls them, that deceives people at spiritual seances and haunts the earth for a time, and eventually becomes annihilated. The good part of the ego retires to Devanchan, rosy sleep, in which state it remains 1500 years, after which it becomes reincarnated. This process has to be gone through at least 800 times, so that it takes about 1,250,000 years to become a Mahatma. No wonder there are so few of them. When a man reaches this stage of his existence, he is declared to be perfect, and he leads the life of a hermit amid perpetual snow in some mountain range. He spends his time in prayer and in studying the secret forces of nature in his subterranean libraries. He appears to require neither food nor fire, and he wears a robe of the thinnest white calico. He enjoys the great advantage of being able to slip out of this material body as easily as a man can slip out of his trousers. And he can project his astral body with the greatest rapidity to any part of the world, thus avoiding the danger and expense of a flying machine. Beyond this, and the fact that he requires neither postage nor insurance stamps, I see no advantage in being a Mahatma. There is no reliable record of any member of the Theosophical Society ever having seen a Mahatma in his material body. Madame Blavatsky states she saw two, Moria and Kuthumi. Several Theosophists believe they have seen Mahatmas in their astral bodies and in visions and dreams. According to their portraits, which have been painted, they resemble John King, the well-known spirit who has a reputation of being the most industrious spirit that has ever rapped a table. He was certainly a most hard-working spirit 40 years ago, when spiritualism was rife. I remember that he was declared to have manifested at several seances at the same moment in different parts of the world. John and the Mahatmas are all big, swarthy fellows with heavy black beards dressed in long robes of thin white calico and turbans to match. Anything more unlike Tibetans? It is difficult to imagine. Colonel Olcott states that Madame Blavatsky informed him that John King was her familiar spirit for 14 years. That was before she said a word about Mahatmas. The yogis, adepts, and mystics of Hindustan may be described as half-baked. Mahatmas, they are of two classes. Some of them are demented creatures suffering from religious mania, frequently hypnotic. In this country, they would be taken care of in a lunatic asylum. By a far greater portion of these natives are simply mendicants who find praying more congenial to their taste than working. In this country, they would be called Weary Willies. London was favored by a visit from a Hindu mystic in the spring of this year. He was announced as Swami Baba Bharati, the renowned Hindu sage, mystic philosopher, and inspired orator, a holy man from Hindustan who was formerly editor of the Lahore Tribune. But his religious instincts asserted themselves, and for 12 years he became a hermit, renouncing the world and living a life of austere simplicity in the holiest of India's most holy lands. His visit to the West, he said, was in obedience to a vision 9 years before. He gave a course of lectures at the small Queen's Hall. One was upon reincarnation, and it was said to be the clearest exposition ever given upon the subject. This announcement greatly interested me, for I thought that some arguments more convincing than any I had ever heard in support of the doctrine would surely be adduced. Accordingly, I attended the lecture in good time. After the audience had waited nearly half an hour over the time at which the lecture was advertised to commence, a big, well-fed Hindu sauntered upon the platform, looking as though he had been awakened in the middle of his afternoon nap, who, with an eye to business, introduced Baba and emphasized the fact that he was holding classes for spiritual development, and that we could have 3 lessons for a guinea. The Baba then chanted a long prayer in Hindustani and afterwards favored us with a very long parable which he read from a Buddhist work. So far as I could understand the parable, it had no bearing whatever upon reincarnation. He then commenced his lecture, which he preceded by a bitter complaint as to the manner in which his audience at his last lecture had treated him. Just as I was feeling inspiration coming over me, he said, my audience discovered that it was tea time and went home to tea. He hoped that we should not treat him in the same manner. There was no necessity to do so, for he gave a short, rambling dissertation to the effect that everything in nature pointed to reincarnation. He gave us instances, night and morning, the dead seed which, being planted, becomes a beautiful flower, the death of vegetation by winter, and its resurrection to life in the spring. And he repeated the threadbare argument that most people have an intuitive consciousness of having had previous existence, because sometimes in dreams, scenes, places, people, and things appear quite familiar. This argument is the chief one in support of his doctrine. But as 99% of the visions we have in dreams are up to date, I fail to see how they can in any way support the doctrine. According to the theory, the vision should be of places hundreds or thousands of years old. This is how I wasted an hour and a half and 3 shillings I paid for my seat. This is a sample of Hindustani mysticism, a fair sample of the great inspired teachers of the East, to whom the poor benighted West must look for instruction and guidance in the spiritual material and all scientific matters. No thank you, Mrs. Besant. The West will be far better without the claptrap and hanky-panky you offer for sale at a guinea per annum. Exclusive of a confusion of the vaporings of ancient dreamers palmed off as an original and inspired lecture, copy of it at 50 shillings a volume. While penning these pages, I have received information from Anglo-Hindustani friends to the effect that the Hindustani section of the Theosophical Society is in a bad way. I am told that many of the most influential members, having discovered that the Mahatmas are myths, are leaving the society. For a long time, suspicion has existed among the British residents that sedition lurks behind the society, and that accounts for the unreasonably fulsome display upon Mrs. Besant's first visit to Hindustan. She passed under triumphal arches. Her paths were strewn with flowers, and she was looked upon by the natives as a Joan of Arc to come free them from British rule. This suspicion was strengthened by the support which Mrs. Besant and members of the society gave to Mr. Keir Hardie during his mischievous visit to Hindustan. Persons present at the meetings marveled that the authorities should have allowed such sedition to be preached openly to the impressionable natives. I have no absolute proof that the society is seditious. Still, there is ample reason why authorities should keep an eye upon it. So to the man on the street, I'll answer that question for you. Theosophy is a one-world religion scam. Theosophy is the launch pad of what we have today that talks of one-world religion. Their aim is the domination and subjugation of the masses. That would be you and me and you, the reader. They want to bring us under their control, so whoever's pulling the strings in the background can carry out their plots and plans unhindered by us pesky humans or man, so their masses can go on unobstructed with their plans without having to worry about us getting in their way. And then we see all the requirements it takes to be a Mahatma. Or so they claim, because you know they all made it up anyway. We've seen that throughout this book, and we're going to see some more getting into the surprise I have for y'all at the end. Those Mahatmas are the object of focus, or the deities. I also want you guys to keep the descriptions of these Mahatmas that we read throughout this book and in this appendix in the final chapter. Because moving forward, I'm going to tie this in with things I've learned from RedWolf about the usurpation of our identity. So that's basically why we're starting here with the fraud, because we're going to build up to more things as time goes on. But I'm not going to keep y'all too long, because now we're going to read some newspaper articles from the late 1800s or the late 800s. So without further ado, let's get to it. The Pittsburgh Dispatch, Monday, July 31st, 1890. Priestess of fraud, Madame Blavatsky, the oracle of the Theosophic school, arraigned as an impostor. A Smithsonian professor makes some startling revelations of so-called Mahatmic mysteries. A newspaper man who has been here for some time looking up the record of Madame Blavatsky and the so-called Theosophists has written, as the result of his researches, an account that will probably create a commotion among the believers in the mystic Mahatma. For the information he desired, he called upon Professor Elliot Combs of the Smithsonian Institution. After telling what he knew of Madame Blavatsky's partner and how the two became acquainted, he went on to speak of the madam herself and said, little is known accurately of her early life. It appears that she was Mel Han, born in Ekaterinslav, Russia, in 1831. She is consequently now about 59 or 60 years old. Wants to appear old. One of the curiosities about her is that she has always tried to pass for older than she really is. If not of fabulous antiquity, I must leave it to the ladies to divine the motive of this freak. 6 years ago, she gravely informed me that she was then 87 years old. I did not tell her she looked it, but accepted the statement with equal gravity. Here is a private letter signed by Madame Colomb, written in 1885, to Colonel John C. Bundy of Chicago, but suppressed at the time. Notice this fine feminine stroke. Madame Blavatsky is not Madame Blavatsky. She is Madame Metrovich. I have known her husband in Egypt. I have kept this always to myself, but now that she has tried to injure me in any way she could, I am not bound to be secret anymore. Afterward, Blavatsky is said by Senet to have returned home to Odessa late in 1872, but in point of fact, she was expelled from Egypt by the police or other government authority. Here is a letter stating that Honorable Eugene Schuler, our consul general at Cairo, could probably procure a copy of the official record of her expulsion if he were authorized to do so by the State Department. This affair foreshadows her nasty retreat from probable arrest in Madras, India in 1885, when she was wanted by the police after the Cullum exposure. A Russian spy. Early in 1873, she went to Paris, where she remained about 2 months. Seeking fresh fields and pastures green, the tireless adventuress landed at New York on July 7, 1873. Her real business at the time was in the secret service of her government as a Russian spy, and she was instructed, as usual, to play any part that would divert attention from the facts in the case. She was in favor then, and later, as we shall see, was transferred to India for the same political purposes. The Punch and Judy show she set up in India is thus easily explained. It amused the people and concealed her real designs. Had she succeeded in political intrigue, it would have been all right, but she failed, was exposed, disgraced, and had her pay stopped, and was, as usual, incontinently dropped by her government. One corroboration of this is that, to this day, she flies into her worst rages whenever the Russian spy matter comes up, and repudiates the vile insinuation with fury. That is just where the shoe pinches her pet corn. Not that she should be accused of being a Russian spy, but that she was a Russian spy, made a mess of it, and was promptly ignored. But I am anticipating whatever the nature of the instruction from Russia under which she landed at New York in July 1873. She was ostensibly exploiting spiritualism, then as before and since. But we first hear anything to your present purpose alter she had met Olcott in Vermont in 1874 and been written up by him. Early in 1875, I think in January or February of that year, she married Bentinelli. This man was a foreigner, I think from Tiflis, in business in Philadelphia, and I have seen letters bearing on this marriage, including some of his to her, and have talked with persons cognizant of her brief and storied married life, among them the Philadelphia lawyer who acted in the speedy divorce suit. Rivaling Dis DeBar. This affair was short, sharp, and disastrous to poor Bentinelli, who in his infatuation had scratched the proverbial Russian and caught the very cream of tartar. I think it lasted 2 or 3 months, when her brutal treatment sent him to the court for relief. The legal aspects of the case are of course on public record in Philadelphia, and can be verified by anyone who thinks it worthwhile to take the trouble. This matrimonial episode is a curious case of a woman's perversity. For why should a Blavatsky become suddenly so ceremonious? She slipped the hymeneal halter very early in life, and never before or since this Bentinelli business submitted to be bridled in affairs of the heart. At this time, as we have seen, Mrs. Blavatsky Metrovich Bentinelli had not been metempsychosed into a theosophist. She was simply exploiting as a spiritualistic medium, setting a style and fashion later developed into a fine art in New York by Delise Ann O'Sullivan, better known as the Dis DeBar woman. In fact, Princess DeBar and Countess Blavatsky are like two peas in person, pursuits, and proclivities, though one went to jail for lack of wits, which have kept the other out of the clutches of the law, excepting the Bentinelli episode. Blavatsky rivals Dis DeBar in producing spirit pictures from her real skill with pen and pencil. The Theosophical Society was founded in New York, November 17, 1875. Many New Yorkers will remember the cock and bull stories set afloat about the time of the appearance of the mysterious Hindu adept in his astral body in the solemn stillness of the night time to give his awed and hushed audience behind the locked doors in the Lamasery on 47th Street instructions from the spheres supernal from the formation of the Theosophical Society to carry out the mighty Mahatmic movement of turning the world upside down. Olcott's function in the Mahatmic program was comparatively simple. He was to have a vision, like unto those of prophets still more out of date. In this dream, he was to see the astral body of Mahatma Kuthumi and conveying conviction and instructions viva voce, and vanishing to leave behind him something tangible to prove it was not all a dream. This material textile souvenir of the nocturnal mission was a turban which Prophet Kuthumi left on St. Harry's bed. For all I know, Olcott may still be carrying it about still. He certainly kept it in his coat tail pocket in England and Germany in 1884, as he could do with incomparable gravity, outflick the turban at the critical point of the narrative. What could be said in face of such evidence? A valuable property. I doubt not it has been worth hundreds of disciples and thousands of dollars to the ingenious gentleman. Judge's part in this play, like that of other supernumeraries, was harder work, less pay, and no glory. To describe it, I will quote from Mr. Hudson Tuttle of Oberlin Heights, Ohio, who attended a meeting of the New York Anthropological Society, March 1889, before which ex-Methodist exhorter judge occupied the stage and proceeded to tell the audience about this mythical Hindu. The Parent Society, said Mr. Judge, was founded in America by Madame Blavatsky, who gathered about her few interested people and began the great work. They held a meeting to frame a constitution. This was in 1875, etc. But before anything had been accomplished, a strangely foreign Hindu dressed in a peculiar garb of his country came before them and, leaving a package, vanished, and no one knew whether he came or went. A wonderful tale. On opening the package, they found the necessary forms of organization, rules, etc., which were adopted. The inference to be drawn was that the strange visitor was a Mahatma, interested in the foundations of the society. This wonderful story of celestial messengers bringing documents to mortals is not quite fresh. In the pointed language of the street, it is a chestnut so old that it is quite moldy, and it has been for thousands of years one of the cheapest expedients of rascality to lead confiding credulity. Let us see about these objects of the Theological Society. Here is the last number of Lucifer with the objects printed on the inside of the cover. First, to form a nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, or color. That has been the dream of every crazy enthusiast since the world began. Only in this case, it was adopted as a blind for knaves to make money. It has been for years a stale joke among theosophists themselves that the universal brotherhood is a universal row. Aside from its obviously dishonest features, it has been found to be a hotbed of base and evil passions, strife and dissension, jealousy, selfish ambition, to say nothing of darker and deeper of vice, less against the laws of society than of nature. You can readily understand without further explanation to what the practice of animal magnetism may lead, under the thin guise of initiation into phallic mysteries. The second ostensible object is 2. To promote the study of Aryan and other Eastern literatures, religions, and sciences. How much study of Aryan literature is promoted may be judged by the fact that there is not a member of the Theosophical Society in America who can say the Sanskrit alphabet, let alone translate a word in any Oriental language. And few, I fancy, who use the Hindu word Om on their letterheads know that it is a word. they think it is. A mystic monogram of the Mahatmas. There is a body of Orientalists in this country who know all that is known of Eastern literature, religion, and science, but I never heard of one of them as a member of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky herself could not read a page of any Oriental language to save her life. A third object pursued by a portion of the members of the society is to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers of man. This, like the first object, is not glaringly original, considering that since the first man in the prehistoric Paleolithic period learned to chip flint instruments and build a fire and cook his dinner. The third object of investigating the physical and the psychical laws of the universe has been pursued by a portion, at least, of the members of the human race, as well as those of the Theosophical Society. The professor goes on to show up various frauds in which Madame Blavatsky was conspicuous, claims that her first book, It Is Unveiled, was not written by her, but by an eccentric New Yorker, and says that the real strength of her followers is misrepresented by those who meet and hold conventions, he continues. Theosophists few. The actual operators can be counted on fingers without toes. Judged from the annual report, you might imagine a census enumerator required to keep tally of the Blavatskyites. In point of fact, however, the United States has a Blavatskys 400, as New York has a McAllister's like total. I doubt that the people who have ever taken the Blavatsky oath of obedience and paid Judge the dollar for the privilege are quite so many as these. But say 400 of these, 300 have simply passed in and out. Of the remaining 100, probably 75 are more or less quiescent or indifferent dupes of the dozen or two that stay in the swim for what they can make of the remains of the original Koot Humi hoax. The last annual report states that there are now 36 branches of the society in the United States. 36 into the 400 goes 11 times and 4 over. Enough for an extra branch. I have known branches to consist of fewer than 4. I have known that at least 2 branches which consisted of nobody, the names of the branches on Mr. Judge's books being all there was of them. All that is necessary to found a branch is for anybody to send Mr. Judge $5 for a charter like this. And here, Dr. Cones unfolded an impressive-looking document stamped with a gold seal and signed by Blavatsky and Olcott, and then give him $1 more for a diploma like this, producing a linen-backed document of more modest dimensions. Thereupon he become a universal brother and can fraternize universally, as long as he pleases to send any money to Mr. Judge in New York, to Blavatsky in London, or Olcott in Madras. And the latter would immensely prefer direct transmission of funds, as he has found it expensive to collect remittances via New York and London. Sometimes, however, the formation of new branches is attended with more ceremony. Take, for example, the Blavatsky Lodge in Washington. There was a pauper ex-spiritualist named Anthony Higgins, who went through the Woodhull and Claflin scandals of years ago. Having hired a hall, Mr. Higgins, in the company of Mr. W.Q. Judge and Mr. Archibald Kiter, expounded universal brotherhood to at least 50 Washington cranks by abusing my humble self for several hours. Therefore arose the Blavatsky Lodge, consisting of Mr. Higgins, a woman, and his son in the teens, with several ladies and gentlemen of color, and the next number of Blavatsky's London organ conveyed felicitations to our noble and worthy brother Higgins. It is scarcely necessary to add that nothing further has been heard of or from this lodge, except the vast wilderness of Mr. Judge's annual reports. So we see right here in the article, there's not a book page, that is from an old newspaper. In 1890, they were calling this woman a fraud. Seems to be lining up with the pamphlet we just read over the last 4 videos. We also see that there was a name that was not mentioned in the book, Metrovich. So you got Mahatma Metrovich. Another thing that wasn't mentioned in our reading of the book or the pamphlet is that she was expelled from Egypt. And they mentioned when she was in Egypt and she met the Cullums, remember? Mrs. Cullum and her husband, the handyman, Mr. Cullum, the ones that turned over all the secrets of the scams that they helped conduct? The very same. We also come to find out she fled Hindustan. She was in Madras running her scams 10 years after the society was up and running. And the government of Hindustan was on her neck. And she got up out of there. We get to straight up accusations. Now, this is going to be part of my job to prove the fraud that we're all accusing him of. Because if you remember, the author said that he didn't do extensive research on society. Well, I'm going to do that. It says she came here on behalf of the Russian government as a spy. Now, we all know the cliche of Russian spies. It makes perfect sense to me. And she's doing this at what time period? Reconstruction. And if y'all hang out over at RedWolf's and Curdy Mayo, if you watch Dan Calloway, all of the good people in the community, we all know what was going down during Reconstruction. So I figured that this is the rabbit hole that I'll go down to find answers to how we got to where we are today. And let's not forget that the society was founded in New York. What is New York home of in the last 30 years? So what is New York home for? Hotepery. All them pan-fried ninjas. So I wonder where all that Egyptology and all that more science and all that stuff came from. If you ask me, it came from these ninjas at the Theosophical Society. And then they went over the 3 aims of the society. Aim number 1 being to unite humanity. The real question is, for what purpose? That is, we can all form our own opinion of that. But we're going to see what their purpose truly was. We're going to read between the lines of the future documents we read. Number 2 was to promote Eastern philosophy. Once again, why are y'all coming over here to the West from the East trying to teach a foreign philosophy over here in this land that is so-called America? What's the purpose? Number 3 was to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the metaphysical and psychical powers of man. Seems noble on the surface, I know. But if we've been paying attention to anything since we've been reading, we know they have alternative aims. They're not a group based on truth. They're a group based on fraud. So now that we've covered some of Madame Blavatsky's fraud in a captured time period right there in a newspaper, we're going to move on to the second Mahatma of the Theosophical Society, Mahatma Besant. The Anaconda Standard, December 5th, 1897. How it struck Annie Besant. What the Theosophists said to Steed, the famous editor, about her visit to the United States. Mrs. Annie Besant has returned from her tour in the United States, brimful of opinions formed regarding the people of the big Western world, and by no means loath to unburden her mind of these same opinions. They are not as a whole complimentary to the people of the country she has just visited, but having been given to me for publication, they are handed on for benefit of newspaper reading community. Tell me, where have you been and what have you been doing? I said to open the conversation. Certainly, said Mrs. Besant. I left England in March, landed in New York on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March, 1897. I came back the end of September in the steamer St. Louis, which sailed on the 22nd. I will remain here in the autumn and winter, but in the next spring I expect to go to India. Was your visit confined to the United States? Yes, with the exception of a trip from Buffalo to Toronto and Hamilton. We started from New York and worked westward. We did not dip further south than Philadelphia and Washington, but worked right across the continent to the Pacific coast. Chicago was the place where we found the strongest interest. We worked right through the Great West, passing through Kansas City, Denver, Salt Lake, and as far south as San Diego, which was the most southerly point we touched. Then we turned northward, traveling up the coast to San Francisco, on to Portland in Oregon. then to Olympia, the capital of the new state of Washington. Then we came eastward, stopping a fortnight at Chicago, where we have 4 flourishing branches and where the Theosophical doctrine seems to have fallen upon good ground. Then through Michigan and Ohio to New England and thus back to New York, completing the circle. It was a very interesting trip and brought us into contact with all sorts and conditions of men. This was especially the case when moving through the great ranching country and in Butt. Another curious experience was our visit to Olympia. You never saw such a deserted shell of a town. It is the state capital, and when the legislature is sitting, it may be busy enough, but when we visited during the recess, a more forlorn place you never saw. Houses shut up and hotels empty, shutters up in all the shops, and nobody stirring. One observation, which continually forced itself upon our minds, was that in the western states, it is only the women who read books and the men read nothing. You will find that the wife preserves some leisure for culture while the husband tends more and more to become an unlettered money-making machine. It is an unlovely evolution and one which plays havoc in the unity of a home. I have heard the same phase commented on by other observers. I replied, let us hope that the American woman will be able to resist the downward drag of the unlettered husband. I do not like the outlook, said Mrs. Besant. At present, in the eastern states, there is a great deal of surface politeness, in which respect the Americans are much in advance of other English-speaking nations. But inside, the men look with tolerable contempt on the tact claim of the woman to universal knowledge and take good-humoredly in their airs of superiority. In the West, the whole burden of maintaining the culture of the household is thrown upon a single member, the wife. Mentality alone will not suffice to sustain so great a responsibility and of spirituality. There is no excess on either side. In fact, this is decreasing in the new woman. But is not motherhood itself a great spiritualizing experience, the continual channel through which the divine enters into the heart? Yes, said Mrs. Besant, but the new woman does not want to be a mother. The passion for the motherhood seems to have become extinct in many households. And what do you think of the American newspapers? I saw plenty of them, as you can imagine, for I was the constant prey of the interviewer. But of what I have nothing to complain. When you are on a mission for spreading the light of the interviewer, it is very valuable auxiliary. It would be better if he restrained a little of the exuberance of his imagination. One question they often asked me was if I remembered any of my previous incarnations. When I said yes, they all clamored to know something about them. I naturally refused, saying that it is a matter upon which I could produce no evidence. It was idle to make statements that could not be proved. Notwithstanding this invariable reply, one reporter did not hesitate to make an assertion that I had claimed that I was the reincarnation of Lord Byron, and that it was on this account that I was so enthusiastically devoted to the cause of the Greeks. As a matter of fact, my enthusiasm about the Greeks has never been conspicuous for its favor, and I need not tell you that I never claimed in any way to be the reincarnation of Lord Byron. Nevertheless, interviewer's bold falsehood made the tour of the continent, and I dare say it is running yet. Then you are not much impressed by the spirituality of modern journalistic apparatus? The American newspaper, she replied, is vibrating with intense vitality. Its staff live in the vortex of whirling comic activities, which are utterly fatal to any of the repose or reflection indispensable for spiritual leadership. It seemed to me to dancing a mad carmagnole in which the pace goes ever faster and faster, in which sweeps everyone into a maddening whirl. They live for the day and the things of the day, and nobody ever forgets so completely the things of yesterday as your American newspaper. Spirituality implies calm, balance, and dignity, and these are the only conspicuous by their absence. At first with the scant courtesy, but gradually, as week after week went by, the newspapers began to treat us more and more seriously, until at last there was nothing in the world to complain of as to the tone which they adopted in dealing with the Theosophical Society. How does the Theosophical Society stand now? Very well, said Mrs. Besant. When the Great Secession in America took place, the secessionists carried over 85 of 100 American branches. Only 15 remain loyal to the society. Of these, 3 have since died, So practically we had to refound the society all over again. Countess Squawkmaster has been busily and usefully employed opening branches so that before I reached New York we could count on 22 branches in the Union. As a result of our 6 months tour, we have now 51 lodges organized under 6 central committees with a corresponding secretary in each state, so as to secure their harmonious working and organized cooperation. I left New York feeling that the society has once more been established upon a solid footing, and that its growth and will be steady and sure. The iconoclast negative mission of the Theosophical Society has been discontinued. We no longer go about with a club. What we have now to do is to embark upon a constructive period in which the Theosophical Society will endeavor to make itself the center of the world of religion, of which Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism, and all the other sects and religions are integral parts. The whole drift of my lecturing in the United States, and the essence of all that I have to say, here or elsewhere, is that Theosophy is an opponent of no religion and the exponent of all. To the believers of the other religions we say, we also believe as you believe, only we have the key to explain certain things that are a mystery and a stumbling block to you. And further, we are able to set forth the method by which you can verify the truth of your religion for yourselves. In fact, we hold, not without solid foundation for our belief, that we are alone represent the universal, eclectic, and really Catholic Church, which recognizes as brethren and believers all those who under every form of creed seeks truth and follow after righteousness. As Mrs. Besant spoke there, lifted before my eye a spectacle of Mrs. Besant presiding over a conclave as comprehensive as that which assembled at the Parliament of Religions at Chicago, a council representing all the religions which are known to mankind, united for the first time on a common basis, establishing on foundation of scientific certitude. So we see that Mahatma Besant is an opinionated old bag who had a lot to say about America's newly incoming immigrant class or citizenry. Now, once again, I'm going to sound like a broken record going forward on this channel, so I might as well get used to it. If you are over there, subscribe to RedWolf's channel. We talk about, or we're taught about what's going on with foreigners coming in to New York, Ellis Island. So, I find it real interesting that that's where she decides to enter the country. During that time period, was that the only place that they could come in? I have to go back myself and review some information given to us by RedWolf to confirm that. Now, I want to address something. She mentions that the city of Chicago, or Chilaga, is the city that showed the society the most interest, and that they had 4 branches. They had 4 branches within the city. Now, if New York is known for hotepery, what spiritual movements do we know Chicago for?
You know what, brother? If you were to walk into any mosque in America and you just laid your hands on the first person or the third person or the fifth person that you see, you realize that you're laying your hands on a Native American?
I believe.
Yes, that is correct. The good old Nation of Islam, Farrar Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan. Something tells me the Theosophical Society has something to do with them. And eventually it'll come to light, because I'm going to be down in this labyrinth of rabbit holes for quite a while. I also find it funny that the same woman who abandoned her family before she joined the society has so much to say about the family structure of homes within the so-called United States, or the so-called Union. She hopes that women don't get drugged down by their unlettered husbands, because during the industrial, or leading up to the Industrial Revolution, men were used as heavy labor. You know, nothing's new. It's the same thing today. But it seems to me that she was angry at seeing women burdened with all the housework. Now, we're not going to get into that space of conversation in this video. There's other channels out there for that. And I might make a short clip concerning this to go to a certain community. But it appears to me that feminism started showing its ugly head long before we thought they did. You know, in the 1960s, during all of that chaos. Well, it looks to me that Mahatma Besant might be the mother of feminism. Because, you know, it had to go into, because, you know, feminism gets into all the female spirituality and erotic liberation, we'll say. Sensual liberation of women. So that's another interesting tunnel we can go off into. And I will at a later date. She believed the inland citizens of the United States, or the citizens of the Union, were intimidated by her. Straight up delusions.
Delusions, Mr. Wordsworth. Delusions.
She was really feeling herself with her fake position of power. Like I've already stated, she's not really a leader. She's just a hand puppet being manipulated. And the last thing I want to cover is how she spoke on how basically the society was rising from the ashes, and how she was on a PR campaign here in America as well as a recruiting campaign. She was trying to get as many branches in the so-called union as possible. And she was trying to restore the name to heights that I think it was never at in the first place, since we know that they've been acting fraudulently from its inception. She also proclaimed that she's the sole representative of the Universal Eclectic and of the Catholic Church. Now, quite frankly, I don't think we need to go any further than that in this video. She's down with the Catholic Church, meaning she's involved with the Vatican, and we know about the Vatican, and I will be looking into that and bringing y'all videos on that. That's very interesting to me. Because what's the Vatican? The Jesuits, the thieves of ancient history, the reviser of ancient history. We ain't gonna do that here. We gonna get into it. But I hope you guys enjoyed those readings. We'll be back next time with some more information concerning this. We're not done with the Theosophical Society at all. I'd like to thank you guys for once again stopping by. I hope you guys enjoyed this whole book. I'll be back soon with a whole nother book. We're going to take it another level, deeper into the rabbit hole. I'm going to keep it a surprise. I was going to tell you guys, but y'all see when the next video comes out. I'll be sure to put a post out giving you guys a sneak peek and preview. So please like, share, subscribe. Catch you guys next time.
Why don't you bring your media cameras over there if you want to see some real truth?
So say good night to the bad guy. Go on.
I am a human being. I exist.
Delusions, Mr. Wordsworth. Delusions.
Send the word.